Leo had always been an ordinary man, nothing particularly special about him. He lived in a small, nondescript apartment in a quiet corner of the city, far from the bustling crowds and the constant hum of the world. Most days, he simply went about his routine, working at a local tech support desk, coming home, and eating dinner while watching the news. Nothing ever seemed out of place, but there was always a sense that something was missing, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. One evening, after a particularly mundane shift, Leo found himself walking home through the deserted streets of the city. The cool evening air brushed against his face, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. As he passed an alleyway, something caught his eye, a strange glow that flickered in the shadows. His curiosity piqued. Leo approached cautiously, his steps slow and hesitant. He was about to turn back when a faint sound reached his ears, a quiet whimpering that seemed to come from deep within the alley. Leo's heart skipped a beat, and against his better judgment, he stepped further into the darkness, following the sound. The alley was narrow, the kind of place that could easily be overlooked by anyone not paying attention. But there at the end, curled on the ground, was a figure. She appeared to be human at first glance, but as Leo got closer, he saw the telltale signs of something more. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen. They glowed faintly, like two shards of moonlight trapped in the depths of her irises. She looked up at him, her face a mix of confusion and fear. Leo froze. There was something unsettling about her presence, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. She didn't speak at first, but there was an intensity in her gaze, as if she was searching him, probing his very soul for something. I don't know how to explain," she whispered, her voice soft and trembling. "No one has ever chosen me." The words hung in the air, and Leo found himself at a loss. The woman, or whatever she was, seemed out of place, like she didn't belong to this world. Her appearance wasn't just strange. There was something profoundly alien about her, something that tugged at his instincts, making him want to both protect her and run away from her all at once. He blinked, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "What do you mean, no one has chosen you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The words didn't seem to make sense, but she looked at him with such earnestness that he couldn't help but ask. She didn't seem dangerous, just lost. But there was something about her that made him uneasy, like she was a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The woman's gaze dropped to the ground, her long, dark hair falling in front of her face. "I've always been alone," she continued, her voice distant, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "In every world I've been to, no one has ever chosen me. I've been abandoned, forgotten." Leo felt a pang of sympathy for her. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to help her. "You're not alone now," he said, stepping closer, offering a hand. "I'll help you." For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze flickering between his outstretched hand and his face. But then, as if deciding something in her mind, she took his hand gently, her skin cold to the touch. As their fingers met, a surge of energy seemed to pass between them, and for a brief moment, Leo could feel the weight of her sorrow, the loneliness that had followed her for so long. It was as though he could hear the echoes of distant worlds, of places she'd visited, places she'd been cast out from, and he felt a deep sense of empathy for her. She nodded, but her eyes were still full of confusion, fear, and something darker, a deep, aching sadness that Leo couldn't understand. "I don't know how to trust anyone," she said, her voice barely audible now. "I've never been chosen by anyone before. Why would you want to help me?" Leo looked at her, a sense of urgency rising within him. "I don't know why," he admitted, "but I feel like you need help, and I think I can give it to you." Her eyes softened, though there was still a wariness in them. The moment stretched on, the silence between them growing heavy. And then she whispered again, the same words that had echoed through Leo's mind since he first laid eyes on her. No one has ever chosen me." Leo didn't know what to make of it. But as the strange woman stood up, leaning on him for support, he made a decision. Whatever was happening, whatever was about to unfold, he couldn't just walk away. She was different, and maybe that was exactly why he couldn't leave her there, alone in the shadows. As they walked away from the alley, the strange glow from the woman's eyes dimming slightly, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he hadn't expected. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a need to protect this mysterious alien woman who had somehow found her way into his life. What came next, he had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure. He had made the choice to help her. And in that moment, he realized that perhaps he had been waiting for this moment too. As the days passed, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that his life had changed irrevocably. The woman, she still didn't give him her name, had moved into his apartment, though she remained a mystery to him. She kept to herself, rarely speaking, and when she did, her words were cryptic and distant. Leo tried his best to make her feel at home, but it was difficult. Every time he thought he understood her, something else would surface, something new and unsettling. She had agreed to stay with him, but even that seemed like a reluctant decision. It was clear that she was unsure of herself, unsure of Leo, and perhaps unsure of everything. Her strange, glowing eyes never lost that haunted look, and even though she ate and slept, there was an emptiness in her gaze that suggested she was never truly present. Leo tried asking her questions, trying to understand who she was, where she came from, and why she was so different. But every question only seemed to push her further away. When he asked about her past, she would look at him with a sadness so deep it made him feel like an intruder. She would often avoid the topic altogether, changing the subject or falling silent for hours. Yet, despite the distance between them, Leo couldn't ignore the bond that had formed between them. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was because he had seen her at her most vulnerable, curled up in that dark alley, or maybe it was because he felt the weight of her loneliness, the way it seemed to seep into the walls of the apartment and cling to everything. He had come to care for her, even if she didn't know how to let him in. One evening, as Leo sat on the couch flipping through a book, he noticed the woman standing by the window, her face pressed against the glass. Her silhouette was framed by the city lights outside, and for the first time, he saw something different in her. There was a look of longing in her eyes, a yearning that went beyond anything he could comprehend. It was as if she was staring into a world she couldn't reach, a world that had never accepted her. "Why are you looking out there?" Leo asked, breaking the silence that had grown between them. His voice was gentle, trying not to startle her. He had learned over the past few days that startling her only caused her to retreat further into herself. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she let out a soft sigh, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been to many places," she said. "I've traveled across galaxies, seen worlds that no human can even dream of. But no matter where I go, I always end up alone. I was never chosen, never wanted. I'm nothing more than a wanderer, lost in the vastness of everything." Leo's heart tightened. He knew there was more to her story, but the way she spoke, so resigned, so defeated, made him want to reach out, to pull her from whatever abyss she was falling into. But he also understood that this was more than just a matter of loneliness. There was something deeper, something darker in her past that she wasn't ready to share, and he wasn't sure if she ever would be. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she added quietly, her eyes still fixed on the lights outside. "But I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to stop being the one no one chooses." The words struck Leo harder than he expected. He had never truly thought about how much those words must have hurt her. How long had she been carrying the weight of being unwanted? How many times had she been abandoned by those she trusted? The realization hit him with full force. He had to find a way to help her, not just by offering her shelter, but by offering her a chance to heal, to find a place where she was wanted. "I chose you," Leo said before he could stop himself. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything he was feeling. "I don't know why, but I chose you. You're not alone." For a moment, she didn't react. She didn't turn to look at him, didn't even acknowledge the words he had spoken. Leo wasn't sure if she had even heard him. But then, something changed in the air, something subtle, like a shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had hung between them for so long seemed to ease, even if just for a moment. Finally, she turned around, her eyes meeting his. For the first time since she arrived, Leo saw a flicker of something in them, something softer, more human. She didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a glimmer of recognition, of something unspoken between them. "Why?" she asked, her voice still quiet, but with a trace of curiosity now. "Why did you choose me?" Leo didn't have an answer for her, not one that made sense. He wasn't sure why he had chosen to help her when she seemed so distant, so unwilling to let anyone in. But as he looked at her, standing there in the dim light, he knew that he couldn't just walk away. There was something about her, something deep inside her, that made him believe that she deserved a chance to find something more than loneliness. "I don't know," Leo said honestly. I couldn't leave you there. You don't deserve to be alone." She was silent for a long moment, and then, almost as if considering his words, she nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can believe that," she said softly. "But I want to. I want to believe that maybe, for once, I'm not just a wanderer. Maybe I'm chosen." Leo didn't have the answers she was looking for, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. Whatever was going on with this woman, whatever her past was, they were on this journey together. And that, in itself, was a step forward, no matter how small. The days that followed were filled with a strange quietness. Leo had tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but every interaction with the woman left him more puzzled than the last. She had become more comfortable around him, but only just enough to exist in the same space without completely withdrawing. She would sit by the window for hours, gazing out at the city like she was waiting for something, or perhaps searching for something she could never find. Leo had learned not to press her for answers. Instead, he spent his time trying to understand her through what little she revealed, hoping one day she would open up completely. It wasn't until a week after she arrived that something changed. The peaceful atmosphere in the apartment was shattered one evening, as Leo came home to find the woman pacing restlessly. There was an air of tension around her, an energy that wasn't there before. He could sense it immediately, and it made his stomach twist with unease. "Is something wrong?" he asked, dropping his bag by the door. She didn't look at him right away. Instead, her gaze was fixed on the door, her fists clenched at her sides, her body taut with an unspoken anxiety. Her face was pale, almost as if the weight of 1,000 invisible burdens had settled on her shoulders. "I have to leave," she said, her voice thin and urgent. Leo's heart sank. He hadn't expected her to say that. Not now, not after everything they had shared. "What do you mean? Why? Where are you going?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Leo saw something more than the mask of distance she wore so often. There was fear in her eyes, an unmistakable terror that shook him to his core. "They're coming for me. I can't stay here. It's too dangerous for both of us." Leo froze, his thoughts spinning. "Who's coming for you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's trying to hurt you?" She took a step back, her eyes darting to the window, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. "I can't explain it to you, Leo. You wouldn't understand." Her breath was ragged, as if just speaking the words drained her energy. "But you need to know this. I wasn't just abandoned. I was exiled. My people, they cast me out. They wanted me gone because of what I am." Leo's mind raced as he processed her words. Exiled. Cast out. There was so much she wasn't saying, so much she was still keeping hidden. He could feel her pain, her fear, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. "Please, just tell me the truth," Leo pleaded, his voice softening as he stepped closer to her. "You're not alone anymore. You can trust me. Whatever's happened to you, I'll help you." For a long moment, she was silent, her eyes searching his face, as if debating whether or not to reveal what had been buried deep inside her for so long. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not just from another planet. I'm not just some alien lost in a strange world. I'm a part of something bigger, something dangerous, and I'm here because I've been exiled. Banished from my home because of the power I hold." Leo blinked, trying to make sense of her words. Power. What did she mean? But before he could ask, she continued, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and shame. "My people, they are a highly advanced species, capable of manipulating forces that humans can't even begin to understand. But I was different. I was born with abilities that they couldn't control. I could alter things, bend them to my will in ways that even they feared. And when they realized what I was capable of, they decided to get rid of me." Her eyes fell to the floor, and she took a slow, shaky breath. "They didn't want me to be part of their world anymore. They abandoned me, cast me aside like I was nothing." Leo's mind was reeling. The woman standing before him was not just an alien. She was something far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. But the way she spoke about her people, her voice filled with bitterness and hurt, made him wonder if they were the real monsters in her story. "They exiled you," Leo whispered, his heart aching for her. "But why? Why did they do that to you?" Her gaze flickered back to him, her eyes dark with a pain that seemed ancient, as though it had been festering for eons. "Because they were afraid. They feared what I could do. I didn't fit into their perfect vision of order and control. So they left me to wander, abandoned, alone. And I've been running ever since." The weight of her words pressed heavily on Leo's chest. He couldn't even begin to comprehend the depth of her pain, the horror of being abandoned by her own people, cast out because she was different. He could see it now, the signs of someone who had been discarded, who had spent too long fighting the loneliness of being unwanted. "But you're here now," Leo said, his voice filled with determination. "You're not alone anymore. I won't let them hurt you." She shook her head slowly, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't understand. You can't protect me. You're just a human. They're coming, Leo. They'll stop at nothing to take me back. They'll destroy everything in their path to make sure I don't escape." Leo's chest tightened at the thought of her being taken away, of her being subjected to whatever horrors her people had in store for her. His protective instincts surged within him, and without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, grounding her in the moment. "I don't care what they'll do. I'll protect you. We'll find a way to fight back," Leo said, his voice resolute. "You don't have to face this alone. I won't let them take you from me." The alien woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You don't know what you're saying. It's not that simple." "I know it's not simple," Leo replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "But I've made my choice, and that choice is you." For the first time, the woman's guard seemed to lower slightly. She squeezed his hand, a flicker of hope crossing her face. It was small, but it was there. And for Leo, it was enough. As the night stretched on, the weight of the world seemed to press down on them. But in that moment, they were no longer just two strangers. He was the man who had chosen to protect her, and she was the woman who, for the first time in her life, had someone who cared enough to stand by her. The future was uncertain, and the dangers she spoke of were real. But Leo had made his decision, and whatever came next, he would face it with her by his side. Together, they would fight whatever shadows lurked on the horizon, because he knew one thing for certain: she was worth fighting for. The days that followed the revelation of her past were a blur of anxiety and silent determination. Leo had never imagined that his quiet, unassuming life would be thrown into such chaos, But now, everything had changed. He couldn't look at the woman the same way anymore, not after hearing what she'd endured. He couldn't just see her as the mysterious alien who had stumbled into his life. She was a survivor, a warrior in her own way, and Leo had become something he never expected, her protector. But even as he made that commitment, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Her words echoed in his mind over and over again. "They'll destroy everything to take me back." The alien woman had warned him, but Leo wasn't sure what he was truly up against. He had no idea what kind of power her people wielded, but he knew one thing: they wouldn't stop. Not for her, and certainly not for him. Leo's mind raced with possibilities. How could he protect her when he had no idea what threats they faced? His simple life had never prepared him for this. He was just a guy who worked a dead-end job and spent his free time reading novels and playing video games. None of it had prepared him for the reality of being thrust into a cosmic war he didn't understand. But despite the fear, despite the unknown, there was something else that kept him grounded. It was her. The way she looked at him. The way she seemed to trust him even when she barely understood why. There was a softness in her eyes now that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of hope, of something worth fighting for. One night, as they sat in the dim glow of the apartment's lights, Leo tried to ask her more questions, hoping to understand how they could prepare. But she hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table in front of her. "I don't want to drag you into this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have no idea what you're getting into. My people, they are ruthless. They will stop at nothing to reclaim me, to put me back in their control. You'll be in danger just by being near me." Leo looked at her, his resolve hardening. "I'm not afraid. You don't have to carry this burden alone. If they want you, they're going to have to go through me." She shook her head, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Leo's heart ache. "You don't understand. I've seen what they can do. They're not like anything you've ever encountered. They've destroyed entire civilizations, wiped out entire planets. I'm not just an alien. I'm a weapon to them. And if they come for me, they will destroy everything in their path to get what they want." The weight of her words hit Leo like a ton of bricks. A weapon. He had never thought of her like that. Never wanted to. But now, in the face of the cold, hard truth, he realized how much danger they were both in. How much he had yet to understand about the situation they were in. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wouldn't back down. Not now. Not when he had made a promise to protect her. "You don't have to face this alone," Leo said again, his voice unwavering. "We'll find a way to stop them. You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to determine whether or not he was just another person who would eventually abandon her. The doubt in her gaze was unmistakable, and Leo felt his chest tighten. But then, as if something inside her had shifted, she let out a quiet sigh and nodded. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "Maybe we can do this together." But even as she said the words, Leo could see the fear creeping back into her eyes. She had been alone for so long, exiled and abandoned by her people. She had learned to trust no one. He could see how hard it was for her to even consider the idea of relying on him. It was a battle that went deep inside her, a conflict between the part of her that wanted to trust him and the part that feared he, too, would betray her. It wasn't until a week later that the first sign of danger arrived. Leo had been out running errands when he returned home to find the woman pacing, her face pale and her eyes wide with panic. She didn't need to say anything for Leo to understand. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the dread that seemed to hang around her like a suffocating fog. "They're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo froze. He had no idea who they were, but he knew one thing for sure. Something was coming. Something that wasn't just a figment of her fears. She had told him that they would come for her. And now it was happening. The nightmare she had warned him about was real. "Who?" he asked, his voice strained. She turned to him, her eyes wide with terror. My people. The ones who exiled me. They found me. They've tracked me here. Leo's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. Her past wasn't just something distant, something to be left behind. Her people were coming for her, and they would stop at nothing to take her back, to reclaim their lost weapon. But there was no time to think, no time to prepare. He could hear the distant sound of something. Footsteps, low voices, too far off to make out, but the urgency was palpable. They were close, very close. We have to go, the woman urged, her voice urgent. We can't stay here. They're too powerful. Leo looked at her, his mind spinning. There was no way they could outrun them, not with whatever power these aliens had. They needed a plan, a way to escape. But there was no plan, no immediate solution, just the knowledge that their time was running out. Where do we go? Leo asked, his voice tight with uncertainty. She paused for a moment, her eyes flickering with something Leo couldn't place. Then, in a voice as quiet as the night, she said, I know a place. A hidden place where they can't find us. It's the only chance we have. With no other options, Leo nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. Together, they moved toward the door, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both. The woman had been running for so long, fleeing from her past, but now they had no choice but to confront it. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. And for Leo, that was enough. The days that followed their hasty departure were a blur of motion and fear. Leo had never experienced anything like this before. His life had always been predictable, simple, but now it was as though he had been thrust into the heart of a storm, unable to see the end. With every passing hour, the sense of urgency grew, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy stone in his chest. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, had led him to a secluded location deep in the outskirts of the city, a place so hidden and remote that even the most advanced technology would have difficulty finding it. The building they had taken refuge in was old, abandoned for years. Its stone walls were cracked, the windows covered in grime, the doors barely hanging on their hinges. It felt like a relic from another time, a place untouched by the world outside. But as Leo stepped inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The silence that enveloped them was deafening, like the building was holding its breath, waiting. For the first time since they had fled, Leo noticed that the woman seemed more at ease, her tense posture slightly relaxed, as though being here brought her some semblance of comfort. She led him through narrow, winding corridors, past rooms filled with dust and forgotten memories, until they reached the very heart of the building. A small, dimly lit room with a single chair at its center. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that Leo didn't recognize, alien, yet hauntingly familiar in their complexity. This is it, the woman said quietly, her voice distant, almost reverent. She looked at the markings with a mixture of fear and awe, her hand gently brushing against the wall. This is where I was exiled, where they left me. Leo glanced around, taking in the eerie stillness of the room. He could feel the weight of history in the air, the echo of something dark and powerful. It was clear that this place held memories, painful memories, that the woman had never shared with him. He wanted to ask more, to demand answers to the questions that had been building in his mind ever since she first entered his life. But he held back, not wanting to push her too far. She had already given him so much of herself, more than he had expected. They abandoned me here, she continued, her eyes now fixed on the symbols. They thought that by leaving me here, they would break me. But they didn't understand. This place, it's a part of me now. It's where my power was sealed away. It's where I became who I am. Leo didn't fully understand what she meant, but he could hear the pain in her voice. She wasn't just speaking of exile. She was speaking of something deeper, something that had shaped her into the person she was today. The person who had spent years running, hiding, always looking over her shoulder, never knowing peace. He stepped closer to her, his voice soft but steady. I don't know what you've been through, But I do know this. I'm not going to leave you. I'm with you, no matter what. She turned to him then, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or perhaps just the faintest trace of trust. It was the first time she had let herself look at him without that guarded expression, the one that had been in place since they met. I don't know how to believe that, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. I've been abandoned so many times, Leo. How can I trust that you won't leave me too? Leo's heart tightened. He knew the weight of her words, the burden she carried. He had always known she was running from something, but he hadn't realized just how deep that hurt went. She had never truly believed that someone could care for her, could stand by her side without asking for anything in return. Her past had taught her otherwise. You don't have to trust me right away, Leo said, his voice firm. But you don't have to carry this alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere. I promise. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the silence of a past that neither of them could escape. Leo wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that he had made his choice. There was no going back now. Whatever came for her, whatever danger lay ahead, he would face it with her. Just as he was about to say something else, a sharp sound broke the silence. Something distant, a soft thud that seemed to come from deep within the building. His heart skipped a beat. The woman's eyes immediately darted to the ceiling, her body stiffening with the unmistakable tension of someone who had learned to recognize danger long before it arrived. They've found us, she said, her voice cold and flat, as though she had been expecting this moment for years. They've been tracking me. Leo's chest tightened, his mind racing. He had thought they might have a little more time, that they could at least plan their next move. But it was clear now that they were out of time. The woman had led him here for safety, but the safety had only been temporary. The storm was coming, and they were right in its path. Do you have any way of stopping them? Leo asked, his voice tight with urgency. She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a resigned acceptance. No, I'm not sure I can. But I won't let them take me again. Leo took a deep breath, his mind spinning with a dozen different possibilities, none of them good. He didn't know what kind of enemies they were facing, but he knew one thing for sure. If they were coming for her, they wouldn't stop until they had her. We have to leave, Leo said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. We can't stay here. We need to move now. The woman nodded, though her face was pale, her expression filled with an almost palpable sadness. There's nowhere else to go. They'll follow us wherever we go. We'll figure something out, Leo said, determination creeping into his voice. But we need to move now. With no time to waste, they quickly gathered what little they had and left the room, stepping back into the winding corridors of the building. But even as they moved, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere, out there, their enemies were closing in. As they stepped into the cold night air, Leo looked over at the woman. He could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, something he hadn't seen before, a glimmer of hope, a glimmer that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this together. And for the first time since their flight had begun, Leo allowed himself to believe that they could. But even as they ran, Leo knew one thing for sure. The fight was just beginning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night had descended like a heavy curtain, suffocating the world in its dark embrace. Leo and the woman, whose name, for all his persistence, he still hadn't learned, moved silently through the streets, their footsteps muffled by the soft hum of the city around them. Leo felt as if he were in a dream, one where the boundaries of reality have dissolved, and everything was a blur of fear, confusion, and raw determination. The woman's presence was a constant weight beside him, both a comfort and a reminder of the peril that now loomed over them. They had left the abandoned building behind, but Leo knew they couldn't just keep running. They needed answers, a way out, a plan, anything. The woman had been evasive, her eyes always darting to the horizon, always searching for something he couldn't see. She hadn't said much since their brief conversation in the old room, her words still hanging between them like an unsaid truth. The realization that they were being hunted was heavy in the air. But no matter how many questions Leo asked, she never offered much more than fragmented pieces of a much larger story. He could see the walls she had built around herself, walls she wasn't ready to tear down. As they walked, Leo's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who were these people after her? Why did they want her so badly? What was the nature of the power she had described? The power that had made her so dangerous in the eyes of her people. It was as though every new question led to more confusion, more questions that only deepened the mystery. The answers seemed just out of reach, like pieces of a puzzle scattered in the dark. And with every step, Leo found himself caught between his loyalty to her and the mounting terror that they were being tracked, hunted by something beyond their control. They reached a small park near the edge of the city, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. It was quieter here, the usual buzz of the city replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. The woman stopped suddenly, her gaze fixed on a nearby bench. She looked at Leo, her eyes filled with uncertainty, a deep wariness that made him ache for her. She had spent her entire life running from something Leo still didn't fully understand. And now he was right in the thick of it, just as vulnerable as she was. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. The words were a rare admission, a rare moment of vulnerability that she usually kept locked away. It was the first time she had openly acknowledged the weight of the situation, the fear that had been there from the start. Leo paused beside her, his heart aching for the woman who had been through more than he could ever comprehend. He wanted to say something to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, he didn't know if it would be. He didn't know if they could outrun what was coming for them. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face it alone. "We'll figure it out," Leo said, his voice steady, even though his own doubts gnawed at him. "We'll find a way. We're in this together." She turned to him, her eyes searching his face as though looking for the truth in his words. For a moment, there was silence between them, a silence that stretched longer than either of them was comfortable with. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if coming to some quiet decision within herself. "I've been running for so long," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I don't even know if I can stop anymore. My people, they won't let me go. They've already sent out the signal. It won't be long before they find us." Leo felt a chill run through him at her words. They had already sent out the signal. That meant they weren't just looking for her. They were actively tracking her, pinpointing her location. The sense of helplessness washed over him, but he forced himself to push it aside. If he let himself drown in fear, he wouldn't be able to protect her. He had to keep moving, keep thinking. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice tight. "Not long," she answered, her eyes flickering nervously toward the dark streets. "Maybe a few hours, maybe less." His heart skipped a beat. They had no time to waste. Leo's mind raced, but it was clear now that they had to get out of the city. It was the only option. They needed to disappear, to hide. They couldn't stay in one place any longer, not with the danger closing in on them like a storm. "We have to move," Leo said quickly. "We'll leave the city, head somewhere remote, somewhere they won't expect. We can't stay here." The woman's face hardened, a new resolve settling over her. "I know a place," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But we'll have to move fast. Once they've locked onto our location, they won't stop until they've found us." Leo nodded, his mind already working, plotting their next move. He had no idea where this place was, or what dangers lay ahead. But he trusted her. In some strange way, he trusted her more than he trusted anyone else in his life. The stakes were too high to question her judgment now. He just had to keep her safe, and the rest would follow. They didn't speak much as they began walking again, their pace quickening as the urgency of the situation pressed on them. Leo's eyes constantly darted around, scanning their surroundings, but everything seemed still, too still. It was as if the world had gone quiet, holding its breath in anticipation. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every shadow could be hiding something or someone, waiting to strike. They passed through the quiet streets, moving faster now, until they reached the outskirts of the city. The woman led him down a narrow, forgotten path that seemed to disappear into the dense trees. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the earth, the only noise now the rustling of leaves underfoot. It felt surreal, like they were slipping away from the world, from the life they had once known, into an unknown future. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. And then, just as they reached the edge of the forest, the woman stopped dead in her tracks. Leo's heart leaped into his throat, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "They've found us," she whispered, her voice trembling. The look on her face told him everything he needed to know. It was too late. Leo didn't have time to react. A sudden, shrill sound filled the air, followed by a deep, resonating hum that seemed to come from all around them. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shake, and the air thickened with an unnatural pressure. The woman's eyes widened in terror as she looked up into the trees, her face pale. "They've already activated their tracking systems," she whispered, panic rising in her voice. "We're too late. They know where we are." Leo's pulse quickened as the world seemed to close in around them. They had run as far as they could, but now it was all collapsing. The storm they had been running from had finally caught up with them. There was no escape. The fight was about to begin. The air was thick with tension, the silence pressing down on them as Leo and the woman stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the distance where they knew their enemies were closing in. The woman's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, her eyes darting frantically from shadow to shadow, as if she could already see the danger in every movement. Her hand trembled slightly, but she clenched it into a fist, determination overtaking her fear. "We don't have much time," she whispered, her voice a mix of urgency and quiet resolve. "They'll be here soon." Leo's heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing, trying to come up with a plan. The woman had been running for so long, always one step ahead of her pursuers, and now here they were, cornered, with nowhere left to hide. His mind screamed for a solution, but the truth was, they were out of options. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but as he glanced at the woman beside him, something else stirred inside him. Something stronger than fear. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. He couldn't. Not now, not after everything they'd been through together. "They won't stop coming for you," Leo said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "But they don't know what we're capable of. We'll fight." The woman looked at him, her eyes dark with uncertainty. She had lived in fear for so long, had been hunted for so long, that the idea of fighting back seemed almost foreign to her. Her people, her enemies, were powerful beyond comprehension, but Leo wasn't backing down. He couldn't stand by and watch her be taken from him, not after everything they had shared. "I don't know how to fight them," she murmured, her voice tinged with regret. "They're not like anything you've ever faced. I don't want to lose you." Leo reached out, his hand gripping her shoulder gently but firmly. "You won't lose me. We won't lose. Not while I'm here." She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. For a moment, the fear was evident in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something else, a flicker of hope, small but powerful, a glimmer of trust. It was the first time Leo had seen it in her, the first time she seemed to truly believe that someone might be able to protect her, to stand by her side in the face of the overwhelming odds that had been stacked against them for so long. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of movement broke the stillness. A low hum vibrated through the air, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of something large, mechanical, and dangerous drawing nearer. Leo's stomach tightened, and the woman's hand shot out to grip his wrist with surprising strength. "They're here," she said, her voice steady now, though still strained with fear. "It's too late to run." Leo nodded, his mind already racing, trying to formulate a plan in the seconds they had left. There was no running now, no escaping, but they weren't completely defenseless. He had his instincts, his resolve, and the woman had a power that Leo could barely comprehend. The woman was different. She had been abandoned by her own kind, cast aside because of the very abilities she had been born with. But those abilities, they were her strength, her chance at survival. If only she could tap into them fully, they could stand a chance. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of hesitation and something deeper, something far more dangerous. "You don't know what you're asking," she said softly. "If I use my power, it won't be just them I'll be fighting. It will be me too." Leo shook his head, his grip tightening on her arm. "You won't be fighting alone. We're in this together. Whatever happens, I'm with you." The woman closed her eyes, her lips trembling slightly as she took in a deep breath. When she opened her eyes again, they were filled with something new. Acceptance, perhaps, or maybe just the knowledge that there were no more choices left. Only action. She nodded, and for the first time, a small flicker of a smile, almost imperceptible, crossed her lips. "I never thought I would trust someone again," she whispered, the words barely audible. "But I trust you." With a deep breath, she closed her eyes, her fingers trembling at her sides. Leo could see the energy building around her, faint sparks of light flickering in the air. It was as though the very atmosphere around them was charged with the force of her power, an invisible weight pressing down on them. The wind shifted, the trees around them swaying in response, and Leo could feel the change before it came. "Brace yourself," the woman said, her voice low, almost a growl. And then the storm erupted. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the world around them seemed to crack open as the woman unleashed the full force of her power. It was like nothing Leo had ever witnessed. Waves of energy radiated out from her, sending shockwaves through the air. The trees around them shook, their branches bending with the force of the blast. But Leo didn't flinch. He couldn't. He knew that whatever happened, he had to stay close to her. The sound of their enemies grew louder, the mechanical hum of their ships drawing closer. Leo could see shadows now. Dark, hulking figures moving through the trees. They weren't human. They were something else entirely, their forms large and menacing, their movements calculated and precise. The woman was right. These were no ordinary adversaries. But they weren't prepared for what she could do. With a final earth-shattering burst of energy, the woman sent a wave of power cascading toward the figures in the distance. The shockwave tore through the trees, splintering the ground beneath them, as the alien hunters were thrown back by the force. Leo watched in awe as the woman fought not just for survival, but for the first time, for something more. Something she had never allowed herself to believe in: hope. The hope that she wasn't alone, that there were people worth fighting for. But the battle wasn't over. From the shadows, more figures emerged, faster this time, their movements even more determined. Leo's heart raced, but the woman's eyes, though filled with exhaustion, burned with fierce determination. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. "We're not done yet." Leo nodded, not trusting his voice. Together, they would face this last trial, this final confrontation. There was no turning back now. The woman had finally embraced her power, and in doing so, she had embraced the possibility of a future. A future where she wasn't running, where she wasn't alone. And no matter what came next, Leo knew they would fight for that future. Because they were in this together, and together, they would survive.